DeHavilland live stream video of 2019. We thought that with the general election last Friday and before you all take a well-deserved break for Christmas, this afternoon would be the perfect time to get together and talk about what public affairs professionals can expect in 2020. I'm Rebecca Evans, the Director of Content at DeHavilland, and I'm delighted to welcome Christine Quigley, Director of Public Affairs at Newington Communications, and Simon Markle, Head of Public Affairs and Engagement at Energy UK. So we had the result on Friday. The Conservatives gained almost 50 seats, and the largest majority that they've had since the late 1980s, I think. In terms of public affairs as a whole, what does the size of that majority mean in terms of the way that the relationship between public affairs and government might differ over the next year and beyond?
Well, first things first, it means we're expecting more and more legislation. I think the last kind of 18 months or 2 years have been slightly frustrating for a lot of us working in public affairs because we haven't had a lot of legislation that hasn't been Brexit focused. I think we're going to see quite an ambitious Queen's speech. We did already have an ambitious Queen's speech, 6 weeks ago?
Yep.
Feels like slightly longer. But it does mean we'll be able to get to grips with some of these relatively technical pieces of policy that have been waiting for quite a long time.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to be seeing is a real confident government, a real confident set of Conservative MPs who really will be pushing forward their agenda. And I think the challenge for public affairs professionals is there'll be a big chance, especially if your organisation may not fit with that agenda or may not agree with a lot of stuff that's going to be going on.
Yep.
How do you get that change? How do you look to get that engagement? And how do you look to make sure your agenda does fit their agenda?
And with lots more Tory MPs in particular, we're going to actually see lots of people now who aren't government ministers or aren't in the payroll vote who will be looking to do interesting things to make their mark. Certainly lots of the new Tory MPs, so actually engaging through select committees, through bill committees, through all party parliamentary groups, there will be lots of ways to work with some of the 150 new MPs.
Yeah, so there are opportunities there for public affairs, not just around the headline stuff held by the ministers and so on, but actually also backbench, new intake, that kind of thing.
Especially those northern MPs. I know we spoke a lot about them in the last sort of 4 or so days. Especially those MPs who are representing those northern constituencies. They're maybe an untrained entity. They're a different sort of aspect to the Conservative Party. A bit like maybe the Scottish Conservatives were. Maybe this bloc that comes in, does things differently to the traditional Tory Shire vote and Shire MPs. How do we engage them? How do we work with them? And it's actually one area I think in the energy industry we're quite excited about working with them because there's a lot of similarities there.
How will you approach that?
So first off, I think it's quite interesting where we're heading towards. It looks like a major reshuffle after January. So I think the first month will be about sort of understanding who that intake are. And who we want to be targeting. There's some really interesting seats like Yon Mon, where we've got the new Conservative MP and how we engage with her. And just how, as an energy industry, we look to be shaping our understanding and their understanding of the energy industry as well. I think we'll do that for the first month, definitely.
One thing that the energy sector has been particularly strong on over more than the last 5 years, actually, though, as well as been engaging with the Scottish National Party. So, we are back to having a very large block of SNP MPs in Westminster who will take a view on certain issues, won't take a view on others. Certainly, I do a lot of work in the transport and infrastructure space. I know a number of our clients, people in our sector, will be really looking to start building relationships with that group of SNP MPs, so we're going to be very influential.
It's a great point on the Scottish aspect, and I think it's interesting. A lot of us in public affairs have become sort of mini experts in Article 50. I think in the next month, 2 months, year, we're going to become mini experts of Section 30 and looking at really what does that mean and what wiggle room does the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament have into forcing the Section 30 issue. You're exactly right with the Scottish National Party, that sort of beefed up Scottish National Party. How do we work with them? Well, I think luckily where we've worked, but certainly at NGK with the Scottish National Party and others, is to build up a sort of broad base of understanding of the Scottish National Party and working with them. Offshore wind is massive in Scotland, onshore wind is massive in Scotland. They do a lot on energy efficiency, and often we work in the Scottish Government and often we work in the Scottish Parliament to really understand those issues and try and actually bring them down to Westminster, get Westminster Government to act on those areas.
So we've talked a bit about the opportunities around select committees, new MPs, Scottish MPs in particular. Are there also, on the flip side, challenges for public affairs teams around there being a government with this size of majority, in practical terms?
Well, I think actually practically one thing to think about is kind of the role of the Labour Party. I think we would expect probably over the next couple of months that Labour is going to be relatively internally focused in the run to a leadership election.
Yeah.
I would say something that we saw back in 2015, a lot of people who were relatively concerned about the prospect of a Labour government decided after the 2015 election they could stop engaging with Labour, and that was absolutely a mistake. And we saw, partly because there wasn't necessarily that engagement with business, lots of policies that were kind of seen as being a little bit anti-business coming through from the Labour Party. So something I think for all of us in public affairs to be aware of is to continue engaging with Labour MPs. There are some fantastic new Labour MPs, and then there are lots of people who've been around for a long time and who we will know well.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think it comes back to that select committee point, whereas Labour will be internally focused, maybe until March and a bit beyond. There'll be some key Labour politicians within there. You know, we'll get to see maybe Rachel Reeves will come back in the base select committee role, which would be absolutely beneficial to Parliament and the government as a whole. She's a great MP, a great scrutiniser of government policy in that respect. But then there's also, I think you touched on some of these seen as anti-business policies. I think there's a real opportunity, and I think we need the public affairs industry to really getting on top of looking at why some of those were so popular, why renationalisation, for instance, was so popular in transport and in energy. And I was speaking to a colleague the other day, well, it's fine, Labour have lost the debate on that, the manifesto was rejected. And I go, well, actually, if you looked at what Len McCluskey was saying at the weekend about actually it's individually those policies are quite supported by the public, and we need to understand why. We understand, and as a business and as business organisations, we need to be understanding why is renationalisation such a popular policy. It's not a Labour issue; it's a societal issue, and every political party has a broad support for some form of renationalisation, public ownership. And we need to understand.
So, in terms of public affairs, we're talking about getting to know new MPs, and indeed continuing to know Labour MPs, new and old. But you talked there about understanding sort of the public view. How should public affairs teams go about that? How can they make sure that they're keyed into those issues and the feelings that have actually brought about the election result?
I think one of the biggest changes we've had in the last kind of 10 years or so in the industry is the increasing use of polling. So, you know, we aren't writing messages anymore based on just what we think. We're actually writing messages based on evidence, based on polling, based on focus groups, and actually really getting to grips with the public sentiment on some of these issues, particularly issues like nationalisation, where as a top line people quite like the idea of nationalised energy or rail or mail or water. Actually, practically when you talk to them about it, lots of people just feel that their current water company, their current energy company isn't that good, and they feel that something must be better and something should be done. So actually using polling and using data to really look at, okay, where can we do better as a sector, as an industry, as an individual company, and then working with politicians to kind of try and address some of those concerns.
Yeah, I completely agree on the sort of public view, and I would like to see the public part of public affairs become a bigger aspect of our profession in the next 5 years. We really need to understand what the public are thinking. And understand the polls, and I think polls have a real part to play in sort of understanding maybe the beginning bubbling up of how people are feeling. But I would really pressure and really would like to see more people and more public affairs people going out and understanding what actually the public feel, going out of London, understanding, you know, what do people feel in Manchester, what do people feel in Birmingham, Corby, Middlesbrough and other parts, to really understand actually that public part of public affairs. We can then bring that back, and that gives us more power to go then talk to politicians and say, actually, the public think this, and this is where we'd like to see it. And one of the interesting things is the development of net zero. What does that really mean? What do people really understand about what that will mean for their lives? And I think we need to get better at understanding that and then being able to go to the public and talk about that.
And on that point about getting out to the regions, I hate to say it because we've just had an election, but we are about to face another set of elections in kind of 5.5 months in a lot of the metro mayor areas. And those metro mayors have got increasing powers particularly on transport, on housing, on policing, and actually some of those now, potentially with the election results we've seen, some of these become a little bit more competitive. So while we would expect on the current polls that Labour, for example, are likely to hold Liverpool, Labour were expected to challenge Birmingham, but that may be slightly up in the air. But actually, could the Conservatives have a chance in Manchester, given some of the polling they've had? It's actually a really important time for public affairs professionals to start thinking about kind of the role of devolved mayors
Yes.
and city regions, and how to start engaging as they are getting into, they're just about to get into the swing of their next election.
And actually, when it
campaign.
comes to transport, the Conservatives have pledged regional funding in certain areas as well, haven't they? So
and
sort of ties directly in.
it will be absolutely a big election issue, and buses in particular. The Tories went really big on buses,
big on
in
buses,
this manifesto, which is unusual. I think part of the reason is that they do want to be competitive in city regions in a way that maybe they haven't been necessarily in what were kind of previously seen as Labour cities. So I think we're going to see quite a lot on buses, both on the kind of electric buses side, but also on bus fares, which doesn't feel like a kind of traditionally Conservative issue, and something that actually Labour has been talking about for quite a long time.
Maybe we should be getting out on buses and really understanding, and that'll help us to really understand what people are going for. I just think about where the public affairs buses. I'm just thinking about where I'm originally from. We get maybe one bus an hour if we're lucky, maybe one bus every 2 hours, and it's £6 to get to the nearest big city. And if these are rural areas, these need to be addressed. And as public affairs, we need to start.
Well, it speaks straight away, doesn't it, to the perceived difference, or the real difference between London and other parts of the country in terms of people's experience and the way that they're able to talk about it.
I think so much of the narrative we've had in this election has been about spending in the north. We've seen it a lot on transport with kind of Northern Powerhouse Rail, or Labour talking about Crossrail in the north, which is effectively the same project, slightly bigger one. We're seeing it as well in energy, and I think that is going to be the narrative of this next Parliament. The Conservatives have won a huge number of seats that they really haven't been in contention for in the north and in the East and West Midlands, and they will be thinking about how to hold it. So I think a lot of that, particularly that infrastructure funding that we will have seen in London and the South East in the last kind of 10 or 15 years, is probably going to start moving north.
So do we think, because there's obviously been a variety of commitments around transport, but some of them do focus specifically on the north and Midlands and areas where the Conservatives have won seats. Do we think, therefore, that now, with this size of majority and wanting to hold on to those seats, the government will focus on getting those things done first in terms of the order of priorities around transport?
Yeah, I think that's been a political consideration as well. So we haven't seen the Tories talking a lot about Crossrail 2, for example. We certainly haven't seen Labour talking about Crossrail 2 very much, because the understanding is that we've got to build something in the north before we build something else in London. So I think the big question will be what happens to High Speed 2.
Yes.
We obviously had a review, the Oakerby review, before this election.
And it's done, right? Is it not ready to be...
It's done. We haven't seen it. It will be very interesting to see what Boris Johnson decides to do. The two big transport infrastructure issues he has actually quite a strong constituency interest in it. So High Speed 2, his local constituency in Uxbridge are not big fans. They don't really like Heathrow expansion either. And the question for him is, now he's been re-elected with a decent majority, he seems to have fended off the kind of threat from Labour in his own constituency. Will he be making decisions as a constituency MP or as a Prime Minister, and how is he going to run that process? And I think that's where there are real opportunities for the public affairs sector to work with government department, work with MPs, kind of educate them on some of the kind of implications of either going ahead or not going ahead with these major projects. Yeah,
well, they've left some of those things open, haven't they? So there's presumably opportunity.
Absolutely.
And in terms of, so some of the things that maybe we've been waiting for, or were actually not far off before we had the elections, I'm thinking things like the environment, the bill, the white paper, things that people have been waiting for ages. Do you think we'll now see those, or do you think the fact that actually there's this majority and we're expecting a whole-scale reshuffle perhaps at early February or late January will mean that there's further delay?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So from the energy point of view, we've been waiting, obviously, what the environment bill touches on parts of the energy industry, but really the big one for us is the energy white paper, which we've been waiting for a long time now. Does this idea of this longer, or this month where we get Brexit done, and then this wider reshuffle then push that back? I know Angela Leadsom was in front of the Base Select Commission, talked about it being the first quarter this year, or next year, sorry. Does that now go back? If we get a new Secretary of State on the 1st of February, or that sort of early February reshuffle, does it then have to go back into their box to understand what we mean? That's a great opportunity for public affairs to be continue to trying to shape it. But it does push back net zero, and we need action on net zero to really push forward and really make sure we meet that 2050 deadline. And I think it's quite interesting when you look at, there's only one thing arguably probably that unites every single MP in that Commons right now, and it's that every single one of them has been elected on delivering net zero by at least 2050. But we had the bill in June this year. We've had, that was 122 quarters before 2050. We're now coming into the second quarter since we've had the bill, so we've now only got 120 quarters left. If the white paper continues to be delayed another 2-3 months, and we don't get any action, we don't get a white paper until June next year, all of a sudden we've lost one of the 30 years we had to meet net zero.
On that particular subject, where obviously all the parties had quite a lot of environmental policies, everyone talked about net zero. We've obviously got a majority Conservative government who'd picked a particular deadline and way of doing things, but actually given the broad scale of talk about it and focus on it, do you think actually that there may be any pressure, even with a majority of the size, to speed things up or to bring it forward? Or do you think that actually the majority means that we can all say, right, it is 2050, we're playing out to that, essentially?
I think before we talk about speeding things up, I think we need a framework for delivery against, and we just haven't got that framework. We haven't got that policy framework right now, which we hope the Energy White Paper would deliver us. I think if you look back at the Climate Change Act 2008 and how the energy industry has delivered against that, and farther and faster, and I think if you look at the getting rid of coal deadline by 2025, it's very conceivable we'll have got rid of coal well before 2025. So what we're saying to government is, give us the framework, give us the policy, clear policy framework which deliver against. We will deliver against it, and probably faster than you set before. If we look at how we've achieved against things like the Climate Change Act and things like that, and other sectors such as transport will have a massive role to play, and then I think energy and transport will start to kind of link.
Because there's a really interesting point there. I think until recently everyone was thinking about net zero as being primarily kind of an energy issue. It will touch every single government department. It sounds now like the Cabinet Office is going to take a much stronger role in delivering net zero, which is definitely a good thing in terms of kind of cross-departmental coordination. In transport, it's going to be really interesting because some sectors are relatively straightforward to decarbonise. Rail is a really interesting one because there was a massive project or programme of kind of rail electrification that was actually cancelled by the previous Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling. So there's some real questions around, are we serious about kind of decarbonising rail through electrification? But aviation is going to be the really challenging one. We all know probably the last drop of oil is going to be burnt in a jet engine. And there are some real challenges in making sure that people can continue to fly, that we continue that kind of the economic benefits of aviation, we continue the connectivity, particularly in a post-Brexit kind of more globalised world, but that we're doing it in a way that doesn't harm the environment. I think that's going to be really, really challenging.
Do you think this particular government with its policy agenda opens up scope as well in terms of public affairs for more cross-working in terms of sectors? So obviously talking about energy, and we're talking about transport, and we're talking about net zero. Do the opportunities to work with housing, say, increase as that focus towards a particular target becomes more pressing?
We're already seeing little bits of that. So take, for example, the Office of Low Emission Vehicles, which sits in between BASE, which is looking at kind of what goes into the cars, what's fueling them, and then the DFT, which is looking at what the cars do once the energy gets in there. We're starting to see that sort of cross-working, but on very, very specific issues. I think actually in certain government departments, it'll be interesting to see how big the kind of Whitehall reshuffle is and whether they decide to change the role of departments. But within some departments already, things are a little bit siloed. So if you look at the DFT, the Rail Directorate is very separate to the Roads Directorate, is separate to the Aviation Directorate, so they don't necessarily have combined incentives, and it actually takes a really strong ministerial team to start working across a department in that way. So I think it will really depend on who's actually in the next cabinet, how committed they are. I think we would want to see probably a kind of a strong cabinet subcommittee which is looking at net zero and is actually doing that coordinating role.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It will need that sort of coordinating role. There's certainly rumours at the weekend that DEC, Department of Energy and Climate Change, could come back in a new form. And so I think many people in the energy industry are excited by that, because some would argue that maybe since energy and climate change has been brought into BASE, we've kind of lost that focus on climate change delivery and energy delivery. I think it's really important we're going to be working together across public affairs agencies, across public affairs disciplines, because energy, from the energy point of view, it will be the enabler. We will not decarbonise transport without greater electricity, and there's no point just burning more coal to decarbonise transport. You need more onshore wind, you need more offshore wind, that electrification, and we talk about aviation being a big challenge. I suppose one of the challenges and one of the plus sides from my side of the views on public affairs and energy in this new government is there was only really one party talking about decarbonisation of heat during the election, and that was Labour. there's a real chance here that we could be pushing that agenda forward, because I wonder if actually the last bit of coal burnt will actually be burnt by some off-grid properties who will need to burn oil, and we'll be needing to see what solutions we have for decarbonisation of heat across the UK. And there'll be some really exciting things around energy efficiency. You know, how and why we are not joining up energy efficiency, the benefits of energy efficiency in terms of keeping people in warmer homes, keeping the elderly in warmer homes, improving health, and these other areas, why we're not joining.
So at this stage in the Parliament, is this a good time to be identifying allies across other sectors and things like that? So, you know, Energy UK might not agree with another body on everything, but actually around decarbonisation, there might be a common agenda. Is this a good time to be thinking about those alliances and sharing messages?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing you can do when you want to kind of go in and meet a new Parliament and lots of new MPs is have third-party advocates. So it's not just you saying, well, of course you would say that, or your industry would say that, your company would say that. You know, really working together kind of across industry, and actually as much as possible with the kind of civil society and the third sector as well. So actually on some of the issues you were talking about around kind of energy efficiency and affordability, you know, there are absolute opportunities to work with organisations like Citizens Advice or consumer groups like Which, and actually having that third-party credibility will make a huge difference in starting to build relations, but also in kind of lobbying on specific legislation.
Yeah. It also comes back potentially to being close to particular groups of people or that bodies can speak for.
Yeah.
And with that majority, with that Conservative majority, you're going to need coalitions to really try and, especially if you're arguing a position that maybe the Conservatives aren't taking, or there's a change to a piece of legislation that you'd want to take, you're going to need that coalition, broad coalition around your policy to really show that there is wider societal support.
So my sort of top tip on that is, if you are trying to work on something which you think is going to be relatively contentious, you need to get some Tories on side. Find out how many people in the constituency are affected. Find out the number of MPs who've got majority smaller than that number of people, and go and talk to them first. It's, you know, it seems like a really obvious thing to do, but actually having people who have a bit of a stake in working with you on a specific issue, and it's back to that point about putting the public in public affairs, whipping up a bit of public interest and public sentiment, which can be done relatively straightforwardly or cheaply through engaging with community groups or through kind of digital public affairs, which we're seeing more of. You know, there are lots and lots of ways to do that.
Yeah. Do you think, in terms of the size of the majority, do you think the fact that we've got this size of majority means that actually we may see an emphasis on things that perhaps haven't been emphasised that much in the previous Queen's speech and the manifesto? I'm thinking things like, you know, Boris Johnson's stated love of infrastructure, and the commitments around energy, for example, or transport. Might we see actually greater movement on some things, or more focus on policy than has been firmly committed to at this stage?
Well, it feels like we've got a couple of new things that are being rumoured for the Queen's speech later this week, some of which are kind of feel relatively kind of, you know, out of nowhere. So Section 21, for example, so ending no-fault evictions, is a really interesting issue. It hadn't been talked about a huge amount during the election. It will be incredibly popular with young people. The Tories are obviously desperately still trying to win over young people, but it's also helping to position the Conservatives as a party of renters rather than just of homeowners. So that's a really interesting one. The right to get to work as well, which we've started seeing today. The Conservatives over the last few years, and particularly in the kind of 2015 Parliament, brought in legislation to try effectively to stop rail strikes through kind of increasing ballot thresholds, etc. And because of the kind of relatively entrenched power of the trade unions in that space, it didn't really work. They could always get enough people to make the ballots work. So actually the Tories are now starting to talk about this in a slightly different way. I think they're probably capitalising on some of the frustration that commuters in the South East are feeling around some of the rail strikes at the moment.
It's an interesting choice of phrase, isn't it, to switch it round to make it about the right to work rather than not the right to strike.
Yeah, it is a really interesting one. They're very much capitalising on that frustration. I think this could actually run and run and run. It's an absolutely existential question for the rail trade unions, who have been able to actually still flex quite a lot of power. They can effectively shut down the railway if they need to, and they will be working kind of across the broader trade union movement, who will absolutely see this a threat, and they will be working with civil society as well. So they will be making the case that, for example, lots of rail strikes are about safety and protecting passenger safety. So even though this is really clever framing and quite new framing from the Tories, this actually could become quite a big issue over the next few months.
Yeah. So something we weren't necessarily expecting.
I think just maybe taking a sort of energy infrastructure side of things, there's some big challenges that the Conservative government have got to address in terms of energy. What we're doing about future nuclear plants. We need a couple in the future. What we're doing around new nuclear. The manifesto was broadly supportive of nuclear power,
But not very specific.
but not very specific. And I think maybe that was maybe supportive, but not very specific. Was maybe my takeaway from the Conservative manifesto around energy infrastructure. I think there's some real opportunities there that mean that it will allow people in public affairs, in energy public affairs, to really be going and setting out a broad example of what the future energy mix looks like. Does this mean tidal is back on? You know, we know the Prime Minister loves a big infrastructure project, something more interesting, and tidal could be that. Does that mean Swansea Tidal Lagoon is back? Does that mean other tidal projects around the UK could come back as well? Possibly, because to meet that net zero, we're going to need that broad mix, and that will include wind, it will include nuclear, and I think as well, if you're one of those northern MPs, you're going to be wanting to see that sort of infrastructure. You know, the UK energy industry employs around 760,000 people, most directly and indirectly across the UK. So we're employing people in every single constituency, and in every single constituency, by every single MP, and I think there's a real chance for us in energy public affairs to be going out and talking about that and showing who is being employed in those constituencies and more where we can see those increased jobs coming from.
The piece of infrastructure that we haven't really talked about is broadband. And
Yes.
actually, I think that's going to be massive. So obviously, Boris Johnson, when he came in as Prime Minister, started talking about full fibre broadband. He wanted to bring the target forward from having everybody connected to full fibre broadband by 2033 up to 2025. Obviously, then Labour said they would come along and nationalise the whole thing, which I think was a nationalisation nobody knew they wanted. Didn't go down massively well on the doorstep, but now people are thinking about broadband.
It's planted a seed of what's possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's some really great opportunities for people working in public affairs in the kind of telecoms and broadband space to start looking at how can this really ambitious target actually be delivered, what sort of government support is needed. And back to this point about kind of urban areas and rural areas, there will be parts of the country where the market can deliver, and there may well be parts of the country where it's more challenging to do so. So starting to have those conversations with government and with parliamentarians, I think will be really, really key in actually helping to deliver some of these targets.
Well, that's really interesting.
It's an interesting point in the broadband. I used to work for Which, the consumer organisation, and about when I was there, we actually went, that's my theme of the bus tour, we actually went on a bus tour around the UK talking to communities about broadband. And all the campaigners went, public affairs people, and it was amazing the sort of the jigsaw of coverage that you got and started to understand. Really, those of us who lived in a big city were really took for granted. You go over to Wales and they'd be like, well, we haven't got anything, or we've pulled together the local community money and got a satellite and got satellite broadband, and you really start to see this actually being quite a big thing. And if the government are really to spread and to rebalance the economy out of the southeast, broadband's going to be the sort of cornerstone as part of that.
Yeah.
In the future.
Sounds like an interesting mix in terms of policies that have been trailed that we know are likely to happen, policies that potentially are more focused on voters that might not have voted Conservative before, and then sort of opportunity for alliances and so on where there might be joined up agendas and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we've only been able to focus on quite a small part of what might happen. And of course, it could all change with reshuffle, and we'll see what's in the Queen's speech this Thursday. But thank you very much for coming here today to talk about it. We can review predictions some part into next year. Thank you very much. And thank you very much all for watching. And we wish you a very Merry Christmas and look forward to seeing you next year. Thanks.